Everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Andrea Perdomo Morales, and I serve as the co-chair of the Social Work Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic media. Cynthia Schindel.
Here.
Thank you. Donna Honer-Quayle.
Present.
Thank you. Sarah Behrens. Oh, we can't quite hear you, Sarah. I'm not sure if your sound is up. I saw your lips move. Do you want to raise your hand? There we go, present. Sarah Behrens has indicated that she's present via her hand being raised. Hopefully we'll get your mic to work here soon. I don't know if you want to log in or log out and log back in, possibly. Mary Gill.
Present.
Thank you. Mike Gillette.
Present.
Thank you. Lee Ann Gendry.
Present.
Thank you. Angie Heller Workman.
Here.
Jane Holtz-Richter. All right, maybe she'll be joining us later.
She did send a message that said she might have a conflict, so if she joins later, I will let you know.
Perfect, thank you. Catherine Reck. Sorry, I think I heard present. Yes. All right. And then Eric, let me try. Third time's a charm. We're going to get this. Eric Schinicker.
Present.
Is that correct?
Pretty close.
Oh, shoot. Okay, I'm going to keep on trying. All right. Kristen Stice.
Yes, present.
Thank you. Robin Unruh.
Present.
Did I say that correctly, Robin?
You did.
All right. Well, I'm going to get it, Eric. All right. I note the following BSRB staff members are also present. David Fye.
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else from BSRB staff?
I believe it should be the two of us today, but others are on call in case we need assistance.
All right. Thank you. Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely. Do I need to address our public speakers at this time, or?
Sure, you could go ahead and have them introduce themselves if you'd like.
Okay. All right. I'll start at the top of my screen. I have Becky Fast.
Hello, I'm Becky Bass, Executive Director of the Kansas chapter of NASW. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Becky, for joining us. Matt.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Schaefer. I'm the Deputy Policy Director at the National Center for Interstate Compacts at the Council of State Governments.
Thank you. Keith.
Hi, everybody. My name is Keith Buckout. I'm a research associate for the Council of State Governments.
Thank you. And next we have the NASW Oklahoma Executive Director.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Ferris with NASW Oklahoma. I just want to say, I don't know what you did to get Keith, Matt, and Dan in the same room, but kudos to you all. That's a big draw.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Dan.
I've never done that before. Dan Watson with the Council of State Governments.
Thank you, Dan, for joining us. All right, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require advisory committees to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. One speaker from the Kansas National Association of Social Workers has been approved to provide public comment to the advisory committee for 5 minutes today, and there will also be a presentation by multiple speakers following the conclusion of the public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting the meeting pursuant to COMA. On July 7th, 2022, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted to the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting materials are posted on the board's website, and you may request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fi@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And Andrea, I will let you know if any other individuals enter the meeting after we have begun.
Thank you so much. All right, the meeting is now called to order and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda. So for the committee members, I'd like to turn your attention to the agenda that you all received in advance, and we're looking for agenda approval for today. So I'll take a motion to approve.
This is Mike, so approved.
Thank you, Mike. Do we have a second?
This is Leanne. I second.
Thank you, Leanne, for the second. All right, all those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Same sign. All right, thank you all. Motion carries to approve the agenda for our August 16th meeting. The next item on our agenda is to welcome our new committee member and board member, Cynthia Schindel. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Andrea. I'm Cynthia Schendel. I am retired from a 32-year practice as a clinical social worker. I am currently doing some volunteer work with Red Cross Disaster Mental Health, this board, and also the Johnson County Juvenile Corrections Advisory Board. I've been licensed by the BSRB since Dark 100. And I was actually an associate social worker way back when that still existed, and then LMSW and then LSCSW. So have been a part of that process all these years, and I'm happy now to be serving this capacity to make sure that current and ongoing social workers have good licensure opportunities, experience, and we're able to provide the people of Kansas with the mental health services that they need, social work services.
Absolutely. Well, welcome, Cynthia. We're very lucky to have you both on the board and joining the Social Work Advisory Committee. We look forward to working with you closely. All right, the next item on our agenda, we'll move on to public comment. And first we have Becky Fast, Executive Director of the Kansas chapter of the NASW. Becky, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank Council of State Governments for being here today. I know you're managing multiple state licensing compacts for different professions, so thank you. And thank you to my colleague, Stephen Ferris. He has represented the social work profession for the last years. They've had many meetings as part of this compact task force. Stephen is a lawyer and a clinical social worker, really has a unique skill set, was on the board of ASWB, has been on a regulatory board. So I just wanted to shout out to him because he's represented all of us here on this licensing compact, and he's on vacation in Colorado and joining our meeting today. So I just wanted to say a few words. I would encourage everyone, there's a lot going on, but ASWB released their report on disparities. The dean and directors of social work has been bringing this up for years. There's been studies, concerning disparities in the ASWB licensing examinations. It is an English only exam, is an issue that I brought up for years. So the racial disparities, gender age disparities. So this board, I really encourage you to read that report. They have state-by-state data on the website. The dean and directors are meeting this week. They have a Saturday meeting. I see them. There's indication they will be calling for a pause on the compact until decision is made on the examination. The compact requires a standardized test, but there is no other standardized test in the social work profession besides ASWB. So we as a profession really need to come together on the examination issue. Colorado does not require an MSW examination. Connecticut has the regulatory authority to remove the MSW, BSW exam. They're looking at that. Illinois and Rhode Island last year in the legislature removed it. Illinois found out now when they removed it, the number of social workers from marginalized communities tripled by removing that MSW examination. It's been a real barrier to practicing social workers from racial communities, ethnic communities. So that is something that we as a profession across the nation is going to have to discuss, and this regulatory board will have to look at some point. In terms of compact, I just want to say I attended the modern mental health modernization committees. Many legislators are really excited for social workers to have a compact, much like the nursing and psych compact. I've been asked many times by legislators where we're at. They're excited to have CSG. David Atkins, former state senator from Kansas. All these legislators know him. He heads up the Council of State Governments. And when Psych Pack was introduced, it just flew through the legislature. So I guess my recommendation to this group is that once it hits our legislature, I can see it racing through, and that you have really had good discussions before that period comes, so that because there is a lot of legislative support for it, and so that is my only advice to you, that you look at your rules and regulations, because it will go very quickly, is my political assessment, policy assessment, as someone who's worked in the legislature for years, worked for a federal congressman, etc. So those are my comments on the compact and the ASW exam. And as I said, not all states require a master or BS level W exam. So thank you today. I have a lot to learn about the compact, been studying it and attending meetings now for several months, but there's still more for me to learn too. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you, CSG.
All right, thank you so much, Becky, for bringing those items to our attention and awareness. All of the committee members did receive a copy of that new ASWB report that was released. Okay, with that, then we will move to our presentation on the social work compact with Keith and his guests. So I'll turn it over to you all.
Hi, thank you, Andrea. I'm going to actually hand it over to Deputy Policy Director Matt Schaefer, who will be presenting on the contents of the compact for us.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and really appreciate the opportunity to present today. I'm just going to briefly share some slides with the group. I would encourage everybody, if anything that we talk about today, I know we have kind of a short amount of time, so I'm going to go really quickly through a lot of these concepts. I would encourage everybody to attend one of our weekly review sessions that we host every Monday at 3 p.m., where we do a deeper dive into the model compact legislation. We go through section by section and review the provisions in detail. So today is going to be a little bit more high level. We'll happily answer any questions that the advisory committee has, but if you want more information and want to go a little bit deeper on some of these concepts, I would encourage you to attend one of those Monday meetings, and Keith can drop the link to register for those meetings in the chat. Okay, so before we get
Matt, I don't-
into the model, kind of how the social work compact works, wanted to review some of these commonly used terms that you'll see throughout the compact as you're reviewing it. So the first is regulated social worker. This is a question that we have often gotten when reviewing the compact is, who does this cover? Is this only for clinical social work? Does it include MSWs, BSWs as well? Our goal is that the compact would encompass all three categories of licensure. And so we use this term regulated social worker to encompass all three of those categories, recognizing that there are differences in names and credentials and titles across the country. And so we just kind of use this broad umbrella term, regulated social worker, to capture just anyone who holds a social work license, regardless of category or regardless of what the state calls that particular license. A couple more terms here: home state and remote state. These are two things that are important to understand the compact. So your home state is the licensee's primary state of residence. It's where they're domiciled, where they live more than half of the time, where your driver's license is issued. That's your home state. Remote state is any other state that's a part of the compact where you do not live. That's not your home state. So we'll go over the model here shortly, but the idea is that you have a compact license that's issued by your home state, and that allows you to practice in remote states that are in the compact. The next two terms here: interstate compact license and multi-state authorization to practice. So your interstate compact license is the thing that is issued by the home state that authorizes practice in all of the remote states. So it's the license that is granted by the state licensing board in your home state that authorizes practice in all of the other member states that are part of the compact. So the idea is kind of analogous to your driver's license, where you have one license that's issued by your home state, and that allows you to practice in all the other states that are part of the compact. And that ability to practice, that authorization to practice, is what we call the multi-state authorization to practice. And that is the authorization for you to practice in a single state that's granted to you by holding an interstate compact license. And then the last term here is the commission. That is a state government agency, a joint government agency that's established to administer the compact on an ongoing basis. So they're the ones who are going to write rules to administer the compact, and they will govern the compact going forward. So the model looks like this. A social worker who is licensed in their home state applies to their home state's licensing authority for what we call an interstate compact license. So the home state is going to review that application and confirm that they meet all the eligibility requirements, and then they're going to issue the interstate compact license. And that interstate compact license grants them authorization to practice in all states that are a part of the compact. So their home state, and then all of the other remote states that are a part of the compact as well. So at a very high level, that's how it works. You go to your licensing board, and instead of just applying for a traditional Kansas social work license, you say, I want the Kansas Interstate Compact license. And that allows you to practice in Kansas and then all of the other members of the compact. Just to highlight this example a little bit more, so you hold one interstate compact license, and that grants you access to practice in all of the member states. We call this multi-state authorization to practice. So by holding one interstate compact license, you have access to all of the other states that are members. This is a little bit different from some of the other compacts that you may be familiar with, psychology or counseling, where you have to obtain individual compact privileges to practice in individual states. This is a little bit different, where all you do is hold one compact license, and that automatically grants you the ability to practice in all the other member states without having to obtain individual privileges in each state that's a member of the compact. Okay, just wanted to briefly share some of the important provisions related to states and practitioners. So what does the state have to have in place? And then what do the practitioners have to have in place in order to participate in the compact? So the first thing that we say is that the state has to license and regulate one or more of the following categories: bachelor's, master's, or clinical social work. So what we're not saying here is we're not saying that you have to license and regulate all three of these. It's just one of the following. So if there's a state out there that licenses bachelor social work and clinical, but not masters, they can still participate. And likewise, if they regulate clinical and masters, but not bachelors, they're still eligible to participate. It's just one of these three. And all states regulate clinical social work, so we're not alienating any states here from being able to participate. Number two, require that licensees graduate from an accredited social work program corresponding to that category of licensure sought. So that's BSW for the bachelor's category, MSW or higher for master's and clinical. And that's an accredited social work program. Number three, require that licensees pass the qualifying national exam category corresponding to category of license sought. So I'll pause here and talk about this a little bit because we've gotten a lot of questions here. What does qualifying national exam mean? So how this is currently drafted is that it's talking about a national exam for licensure, which currently is the ASWB exam. There's no other exam out there used on a national level that states use for licensure. The reason why we use the term qualifying national exam and we don't explicitly name the ASWB exam is to anticipate some evolution in the profession around testing practices. So what if there is a new assessment that is made in the future, 10 or 20 years from now, that states start to use for licensure instead of the ASWB exam? And so we wanted the compact to be able to evolve and grow with the profession and not lock in the language to be narrow and only apply to the ASWB exam. So that's why we use this term qualifying national exam. We give the commission the flexibility to approve other competency assessments instead of just the prevailing exam that's currently used by states, which is obviously the ASWB exam. And then number four, require that clinical social workers complete a period of supervised clinical practice. I'll note here that there's no hours requirement here. So if you're a 3,000 hour state or a 4,000 hour state for your requirement for postgraduate supervised clinical practice, all states are eligible to join the compact as long as they require that clinical social worker to complete some period of post-grad clinical supervised practice. A couple other things here to mention. These are more ongoing obligations of the member states. You've got to notify the commission of any discipline action that's taken against a licensee. You have to comply with all the rules of the commission. You have to implement a procedure for conducting a FBI background check, and then participate in the data system. So the compact is going to, the backbone of the compact is a sophisticated information system that the member states all collectively upload information to about licensees in their state that have interstate compact licenses. So all the member states can see who has been issued a compact license, any discipline history on that license, things like transcripts and exam scores, all that goes into the data system. And so this point is just saying that you as a state, in order to participate in the compact, you also have to participate in the data system and upload your licensure data there. Okay, so here are some of the requirements for social workers. So we're moving away from what the state has to have in place. We're talking about what the licensee has to have in place. So number one, they have to hold an active and unencumbered license in a compact member state, and that's their home state, their primary state of residence. You have to hold an active and unencumbered license there. Number two, graduate from an accredited social work program corresponding to category of license sought. Again, BSW for bachelor's and MSW for master's in clinical. Third point, again, the qualifying national exam. I'll note here, there is a provision at the end of this requirement for passage of the qualifying national exam that allows for the commission to exempt those who were licensed prior to their state requiring the ASWB exam for licensure. So for example, if your state required the ASWB exam 20 years ago and you have a practitioner who's had a license for 30 years, they've never been required to take the ASWB exam because they were grandfathered in initially. We don't want to put the commission in a scenario where they're forcing practitioners with 25, 30 years of experience to go back and have to take the ASWB exam. That would be a little absurd. And so we have a provision at the end of this requirement that says that those who were licensed before the ASWB exam was required would be exempted by a commission rule. And then number 4, clinical social workers must have completed a period of 3,000 hours or 2 years full-time postgraduate supervised clinical practice. I think 3,000 hours is kind of the baseline in terms of where states are at. There's a couple of states that are below this. I think Florida and New York are both at 1,500 hours for their postgraduate supervised clinical practice requirement, but the majority of states hit the mark here. And so the vast majority of licensees, clinical licensees, should have 3,000 hours of supervised clinical practice. A couple more here. So the practitioner is required to hold and maintain a unique identifying number. This would be like an exam number or a social security number, something to make sure that you're a unique person in the data system, cut down on fraud. Pay all fees related to the application, complete continuing education requirements of the home state. This is something important to emphasize, is that as a participant in the Interstate Compact, you do not have to complete continuing ed for all of the remote states where you're practicing, only your home state. You just have to keep up that license that's issued by your home state, and that automatically renews your compact license so that you don't have continuing ed for all the remote states where you might be practicing. Notifying the home state of any adverse action on any license taken within 30 days of the application. And then lastly, agree to abide by all the laws, rules, scope of practice of the state where the client is located at the time services are rendered. So this is an important concept to understand, that scope of practice does not travel with you as a practitioner. You have to abide by the scope of practice where the services are being provided, and that's defined as where the client is located at the time services are rendered. So this is particularly important to understand for telepractice. So if you've got a practitioner who's licensed in Kansas, they're physically in Kansas, maybe they're seeing a client across the border in Steve's state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma's scope of practice would dictate in that scenario. That practitioner would be under the jurisdiction of the Oklahoma board, and they would be under the authority of the Oklahoma scope of practice. So if there are certain things that you can do in Kansas that you can't do in Oklahoma, that licensee has to know about that, and they have to abide by Oklahoma's laws and rules while they're practicing there. Okay, just quickly going through this, and then we'll get into some questions. There is also a section, this is section 5, about transferring your interstate compact license. So we've talked about how you have to have a home state license, but what if you want to move? What if you want to change your primary state of residence and move to so you have a new home state essentially? Section 5 in the compact outlines the process by which you essentially exchange interstate compact licenses from one state to the next if you're moving between 2 compact member states. And I'll emphasize here that this is an optional provision that states can choose to implement. This is an opt-in. So the drafting team felt like it would be a little bit heavy-handed of us to force a state to license somebody who hasn't gone through their state's process. But we do give the opportunity for a state to issue a compact license to somebody who's relocating if they are moving from another compact member state. So you might be able to practice there, but issuing a license is kind of a different thing. And so we wanted to give the states the flexibility to adopt this provision or not if they would rather the person go through the full licensure process in their state in order to get a new interstate compact license. Okay, just briefly touch on these sections. This is kind of the back half of the compact. This really doesn't change a whole lot between all the different licensure compacts out there. So what you see here is really similar to what's in counseling, in psychology, and nursing. So we've got sections on adverse action, so how the board takes action against the interstate compact license and what remote states have the jurisdiction to do. Section 8 establishes the Interstate Compact Commission, which again is the administrative body made up of all the member states that's going to govern the compact in the future. Section 9 is about the data system. Again, that's that shared information system that all the member states will submit their information to and allow for information exchange across state lines about people holding an interstate compact license. Section 10 deals with rulemaking. So the commission is going to write rules because there are certain things that will come up in the administration of this compact that are too narrow and too specific to address in the compact statute. And so we give the commission rulemaking authority to address some of those more minute details that will come up. Last few sections here, there's provisions for dispute resolution. So if there's a state that's out of compliance, how do you get them back into compliance of the agreement before they're essentially kicked out of the compact? Effective date and withdrawal. We say here that the effective date is when the statute is enacted by the 7th member state. So that's kind of our threshold number of states that have to pass the compact before it's implemented. There's provisions for a state withdrawing from the compact and then the states collectively amending it together. Section 13, construction and severability. Just like with any other contract, this compact can be severed by all the member states if they chose to do so. And then Section 14, the binding effect of compacts. This just affirmatively states that the compact in the provisions and the rules of the commission are binding on all the member states. You've got to uphold your end of the agreement if you choose to pass the compact, and it does supersede any existing state laws that conflict with it. So just an affirmative statement about those details. So with that, we can transition and take a few questions if we have time. If not, really appreciate the opportunity and would again invite you to attend one of those Monday review sessions to get a little bit more in the weeds on some of these provisions. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Andrea.
Okay, actually, I'll jump in real quick. Since the meeting is being broadcast, we've disabled the chats. That way everybody in the meeting can see what the same information is being broadcast. Everybody who's seeing it remotely. However, I appreciate you you sent an email to me with that information. So after the meeting, I'll go ahead and send that information and those links to all the members of the advisory committee. And then if there's any members from the public that would like some of that information, they can contact me by sending an email to david.fi@ks.gov, and I can send that to you. So I just want to touch on that before we open up for questions.
Thank you, David. And also thank you, Matt, for that wonderful presentation, very thorough. Any questions for Matt? And then I'm not sure, Stephen, if you have anything you'd like to add.
Well, I will. My focus is on states. We got a good overview of the compact, and I've had an opportunity to speak to several states. I've been working on this scenario since about 2005. I come from Tennessee. We border 8 states. We're a strong military spouse state. So being able to come in and leave that state without interruption was always important. And where we are in the process, in the draft process, I would encourage the Kansas board to strongly look at the draft that's out there and look at their statutes and regulations and see what changes may be necessary to participate. You know, one of the things I also look at is the timeliness of it. That we all know the SIPAC, it came on, Arizona adopted it in 2016, but Kansas, they were the 24th state to bring on SIPAC. I think it's in the 21, SB 170, I think. But nonetheless, what the point is, Kansas didn't jump into the SIPAC immediately. They kind of felt it out, kind of stuck their toe in the water and seen what was going on. And I would encourage taking all the information in and seeing if a compact is in the best interest of the public protection for the state of Kansas. I've had that same conversation with seven states now. And there's been a lot of information that's come forward since the draft process began for social work. A lot of reports, a lot of things. We've had some data released for the first time ever. 44 years we've been waiting on data, and we got it last month. And as Becky said, and I don't know if she's checked her email, but since we started this meeting, there's 2 more states that are totally opposed to a qualifying exam. Just released this morning. In fact, one state's like, we're getting rid of the exam by the end of the week. Call me. What do I do? So that would be my advice to Kansas, is just be very familiar with your own statutes and regulations. Look at the draft and make sure it fits Kansas, and prepare yourself for whatever you can do coming down the road to best situate yourself. Because at the end of the day, it's about protecting Kansas and protecting the citizens of Kansas, but also how do you integrate with other states, such as Oklahoma. We have a big interest in Kansas because we're right there with you. But that's all. I'll turn it back over to David, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on that. And if you ever have any questions,
Can you
please
just
call me.
clarify, when you say exam, you're not saying clinical level. I just want you to clarify that.
There's been no indication from any state that's been forwarded to me related to independent practitioners. To keep LCSWs with the standing they have as far as billable insurances and that independent practice component, which is essential to LCSWs, there's been nothing related to alleviating the exam. It's been on those non-independent, the entry-level BSW and MSW, where they're required to be under umbrella of an agency or some type of supervision. It puts us one of the I talked to one of the New England states yesterday, and they were talking about having multiple exams to be an independent practitioner is something that's part of social work that you don't see in other places. Some for me, you take bar exam and you're in. There's not a multi-step process in that, even though the bar exam has components, but that's something that's unique to social work, having the multi-exam process to reach one license. And it has a cost, financial cost. It has an interstate commerce cost. It has a small business production cost. So that's one of the reasons other states are looking at it, from what I've been told. But yes, Becky, nothing about independent practice. It's all been about those scope of practices that are limited, not using DSM, and not practicing as sole proprietors.
So I do have a question for the representatives from CSG, I think. So all the members of the advisory committee have been forwarded the draft language for the compact, and they've had a little bit of time to review some of that language. And I appreciate you walking through the presentation today. That's really helpful, I think, for the members to understand what's in there. It's open up for comment right now. Could you talk a little bit about how individuals could provide comment, and then if there's a deadline for providing public comment on the draft language?
Yeah, thanks, David. Great question. So we have facilitated an online survey to help us out with the process of collecting all this feedback. As you could imagine, there's a really large amount of interest in this. And so we're getting a ton of comments and feedback. And so rather than us trying to organize all that in our email inboxes, we thought it'd be much easier to host all this information online. So we've got a survey, and we have the link to the survey that we sent to David, and he can get it out to all the committee members to submit your public comment and feedback. In terms of a deadline, we hesitate to set a formal deadline because, one, everybody will wait till the last minute, and then two, if there's still significant interest a month from now, 6 weeks from now, we might not be ready to close the public comment period yet. So we kind of just feel it out. this typically takes 8 to 10 weeks, and the draft has been publicly available for about a month. So I would anticipate at least another month, if not another 6 weeks, that the survey will be live and that it's open for public comment. So I would say we'll probably look to wrap this up mid to late September.
Okay. And then I want to make sure the advisory committee understands sort of, you mentioned when you're going through the presentation that some other compacts have sort of a privilege to practice that people can apply for. And this is, I think you called it an interstate license. Sometimes I've heard it referred to as a multi-state license. So kind of like the Board of Nursing, where you would apply in your home state either for a single state license, or you could apply for a license that would allow you not only to practice in your home state, but you could practice in any other compact state with that multi-state license. So for the BSRB, one of the things that we have to figure out is we are a board that operates purely by fees that we collect. So we don't receive any money from the state to operate. And so we do have a number of individuals right now that live outside of Kansas that have a license they purchased from the Kansas board. So if those became multi-state compact members, they would essentially not be receiving the Kansas license anymore. They would be getting a multi-state license from their home state. And then in Kansas, we would be offering our home state license, but we could also offer a multi-state license for people who live here that would want to practice not only in Kansas, but in other states. In terms of that process, I'm just curious if you could provide a little information about, we'll have to figure out how much we would offer that multi-state license for to make sure that we balance our revenues. Could you tell a little bit about some of the other compacts that maybe use the multi-state license approach?
Yeah, so currently out of the ones that exist, the only one that is this similar model of the multi-state license or the interstate compact license is nursing. And so what I would say is, it's one thing for us to say that the revenue impact is minimal, which is the feedback that we've heard anecdotally. But I think, it's another thing for you as a board to be comfortable with that answer. So I would suggest that you go and talk to the Kansas Nursing Board and see what their experience has been. What was their revenue like before and after they joined the compact? And I think the answer that you're going to get is that it's the revenue impact is pretty minimal, but we don't have data to back up that claim. We're just speaking anecdotally from our experience on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Any other questions for CSG?
Oh, I guess I do have one more question. If none, go ahead, Cynthia.
I was just going to ask about the idea of changing domicile. So if you're under the way it's written now, if the states are not required to automatically change your home state license if you move between the compact states, is that correct? So like if I was licensed in Kansas and I moved to another compact state, they wouldn't have to automatically make that my domicile state. They could require me to start all over and get a home state or get a multi-state license based in that state.
Yes, that's correct. And so there are compacts that have this provision. Counseling is one where it is an automatic transfer of your home state. So you essentially exchange your previous home state's license for the new state's license. And so the drafting team that we worked with felt like that was a little bit heavy-handed of us to require a state to license somebody that has not gone through that state's licensure process. I think the group felt like allowing them to practice is one thing, but then actually handing them a license is something different. And so that's why the group preferred this as an optional opt-in provision. And so states will be able to choose whether or not they feel comfortable enough to implement this type of procedure. So
well,
if you have particular thoughts about that would be helpful feedback to have in the survey.
That wasn't a problem with the counseling compact? They didn't feel it was too heavy-handed to require that reciprocity?
We expected to get some pushback on that from the counseling boards, and we really didn't hear anything. Dan was a little bit more involved in that process than I was. Dan, anything else you would say about that?
Well, the same provisions in OT, and we didn't hear anything from the board. For counseling, the boards asked for it. Their association sent us a letter asking that kind of provision be included. So it was, no, there was no qualms since we've got communication from the board saying we want this.
I mean,
I will also
essentially,
note I'll note is that counseling only covers the highest level of counseling, which we call licensed professional counseling. So you have to be able to independently diagnose, assess, and treat. And so it's a little bit different because with social work, we're trying to capture those 3 categories of licensure rather than just the highest level.
okay, thank you.
So the question I was going to ask was, the language has been released for draft and comments. Based on the time frame, is this something you expect to be ready for consideration by the 2023 legislature or potentially the 2024 legislature?
Certainly by 2024. It was initially our goal to release this for the 2023 session. I still think that is a potential. All the discussions around the exam have made us rethink that commitment a little bit. And so if there's going to be significant changes because of states reconsidering requirements around the exam, that's going to be really important and have ramifications for the compact. So we don't want to rush something out the door just to get it out in 2023 when it really is not following the trajectory of the profession and the prevailing licensure requirements.
I have a question. This is Mike. Dealing with military, it's mentioned multiple times through the material. Currently, military persons working with the Veterans Administration, their licenses remain in their original state, and they're able to practice in different military installations regardless of what state laws may be. What is meant, or why is that even mentioned in this compact?
What you're speaking of is federal employees. If you're a federal employee licensed in one state, the compact, regardless if it's social work, nursing, what have you, it addresses military spouses. It extends that privilege over to military spouses because they travel with active military. So that's when you see those languages in the compact, it is specific to a traveling military spouse in lieu of a federal employee.
Yeah, and that did raise a question because we do have many military spouses that this could apply to that I'm aware of. And so if a person becomes a GS employee, though, even though they're moved to a different state, now they've gotten their degree, whatever, and they apply back to their state, wherever they came from. So it still seems confusing. Are they then would fall under the federal exceptions, but if they were to practice in addition to that, doing telehealth, telemedicine, or something like that, they would fall outside of their federal exemption rule. So would they need to seek a license in the state in which they moved? Or is this going to say they wouldn't have to?
I can tell you, based on my experience, we've been working, NASW has been working with the Department of Veterans Affairs on some changes, updating some of their professional standards and what have you. I've learned not to guess when it comes to federal employees. and what that'll look like. But that is a good question on domicile and residency state. But I am more than confident with nursing and the work CSG's done in the past, this will be addressed, and that there will be no negative impact on a licensee or an agency in this process. But it has been done before. I don't know the specific answer as it relates to social work practice, but I'm confident that the people that are working on it will address those very specific types of issues.
Okay, thank you. That's what it means when it's talking about the military, then possibly. Yeah.
Stephen, talk about, I mean, the people who brought it together was the Department of Defense, who initiated this process.
Yes, and I'm speaking, I'm talking for Dan and Matt and Keith, but this entire process was brought to CSG through the Department of Defense in relation to what we were talking about, the military spouses and traveling. And social work is one of 4 recent awards to CSG to help establish compacts. There's other occupations, and social work was chosen because through research, the Department of Defense determined that social work is one of those professions where it attracts a lot of military spouses, and the ultimate goal is not to make sure we do the absolute best for our military families, because it is a family. And when you look at dental hygienists, cosmetology, social work, and they're putting that forward. I have no doubt the Department of Defense will make sure things are right. But this is a joint project between CSG and the Department of Defense. And I know this is not CSG's first dance with Department of Defense, so they know what to do and how to work that. And I would encourage Keith or Matt or Dan to please chime in, because you guys know you know that.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. And I'll just emphasize, so we talked about the provision where you need to change your home state if you change residence or domicile. That does not apply to military spouses. So if you look at Section 7 of the compact, they're actually there's an exemption there for them. So they essentially designate a home state, and they retain that home state designation throughout their active duty service, no matter where they're moving. So if they're initially stationed in Georgia, they could move to 5, 6, 7 states after that, but Georgia, for purposes of the compact, is still their home state. So that's how that works.
How about VA social workers? They move a lot too.
Yeah, and that's a great question. Dan, I think VA, they already have.
Yeah, they're covered. They can. They've got that freedom of mobility, which steps all over federalism. But we'll leave that aside. Yeah, they've got a mechanism for mobility under the Veterans Affairs. Yeah,
which extends to Indian Health Services. So it's a federal. It's not a VA. It's Indian Health Services. All those large employers of social workers, from my understanding.
It's when it comes to the spouses is where that rule might be a little bit different. The military has more occasion where that would be relevant.
All right, well, that was great discussion. Becky, were you going to say something else?
No, I just encourage everyone to give input. And I know NASW is at the table, the deans in schools of social worker. And so we really want each licensing board to give input too. This is really important to get a compact that works.
Absolutely, and this was helpful information to have that discussion, and we'll be receiving the links afterwards, as David mentioned, for us to provide feedback and to also share with other colleagues for them to provide feedback as well. All right, are there any final questions for CSG or others that are on? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We know how busy you all are from CSG and our other public comment individuals. We appreciate you taking the time and joining us and helping to inform the Social Work Advisory Committee of these very important topics that we do need to pay attention to. And I know one of for the ASWB report is on our agenda to talk about further in the meeting. So thank you all. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right, so with that, we will move on to our next agenda item, and that is review and approval of minutes from previous advisory committee that was held on June 21st, 2022. So I will take a motion when someone is ready to approve the meeting minutes.
This is Leanne. I make a motion to approve the meeting minutes as read.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Do I have a second?
This is Angie. I second that motion.
Thank you, Angie, for that second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed, same sign. All right, hearing none, that motion is approved to approve the meeting minutes from June 21st. Thank you so much. Next on our agenda is Executive Director's Report. I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Andrea. So first I'll start with some updates from the BSRB. We are still under some of the governor's pandemic restrictions, such as avoiding in-person meetings. And so we'll continue to have most of our meetings going forward held remotely. But if those conditions are relaxed or we have more information on that policy, we will definitely share it with you. And then we can discuss having more hybrid meetings or having the option to go back to having in-person meetings. A second option I wanted to let you all know about is concerning the BSRB update. We recently hired a new licensing specialist for the BSRB. Her name is Emma Allen, and she started working with us on July 18th. We're really excited to have her here. And if you get the opportunity to meet her, I'm sure you'll be impressed with her as well. So, and then the last item, as far as the BSRB updates, I wanted to let you know a little bit of some of the things that we're working on here in the office. Every state agency is required to submit a revised budget for the state agency by September 15th of each year. Last year's legislature approved a budget adjustments to that current fiscal year, which was fiscal year 22, and also approved any adjustments to fiscal year 23. We are currently in state fiscal year 23, which started on July 1st. And when we submit our budget, we'll have to submit any further adjustments to state fiscal year 23, as well as any changes in a new budget request for fiscal year 24 and also for fiscal year 25. So that is what we will be working on here for about the next month to make sure we have it in before the deadline. In the meanwhile, I'm talking with a lot of vendors that we contract with and some other entities to make sure we have good estimates to go ahead and put those numbers into the budget. I wanted to provide some updates in terms of board action at the last board meeting on July 11th, 2022. Every July, by statute, the board elects a new chair and a vice chair. At that July 11th meeting, the board elected Mary Jones to be the new chair of the board. She's a board member for Marriage and Family Therapy. And the board elected Dave Anderson to serve as vice chair for the board. Additionally, the governor appointed 3 new board members. The first is Cynthia Schindel, who is our social work board member, new to the advisory committee. She has the position previously held by Carolyn Safran on the board. Another new board member is Richard Nobles, and he has the position as a licensed psychologist, and he takes the position previously held by Bruce Nystrom. And then Jim Kilmartin is a new public board member, and he has the position previously held by Leslie Seawester on the board. So we're excited to be working with those new individuals on the board. The board has a group called the Complaint Review Committee that receives complaints and reviews the investigations by the investigators here at the board office. The Complaint Review Committee has a policy called the Investigation Policy, which guides a lot of their work. And the board is going through a process of revising that investigation policy and updating a lot of the provisions in that policy. The board did about half of the updating at the previous meeting on July 11th. And at the next meeting on September 12th, the board is expected to go ahead and complete the revisions to that policy, and then the new policy will be posted on the board's website when it is completed. Additionally, every year the board has an off-site planning meeting. It's usually a full day. Sometimes that is held at different locations around the state. The board made a decision to go ahead and hold the off-site planning meeting this year on Monday, October 24th in Olathe, Kansas. And so that means that a lot of the advisory committees that meet every other month will have one more opportunity to meet to provide any recommendations to the board. At that October 24th meeting, it's expected that the board will try to finalize a lot of the items on the legislative agenda, any items they might want to request from the legislature for the next legislative session. So I wanted to make you all aware of that upcoming meeting for the board. Additionally, I wanted to let you know about a national conference that I attended recently. So as you're familiar with, the BSRB is a composite board and we oversee 7 different professions. I was invited to attend a conference for the National Board for Certified Counselors under the Professional Counselor Authority that we have here. And I was actually asked to present information to the attendees of that conference. The topic that I presented information on was innovations in licensing, looking forward and back. And you may be asking yourself, what innovations is the BSRB considering? Well, one of the things that I talked about was new approaches to looking at the licensing concept. I talked a little bit about some changes in technology, considering re-examining license requirements that boards have in statute, consideration of things like multi-state compacts, looking at new license types. But I also talked about looking back. We constantly talk about innovations in licensing as looking at new individuals entering the profession. But when we were looking at changes in licensing over the years, while there are new individuals who become licensed, there are also individuals who choose not to renew their license. And that's a group we don't talk about very often. And so one of the things I talked about was trying to make sure we get good information out to current licensees and make sure that we have adequate resources for them so they can continue to renew their licenses. And then I also talked about an approach to consider looking at individuals who may have let their licenses lapse in the past and whether there's anything we can do to have those individuals re-enter the profession and become practitioners again. We currently have a policy in place to where you have to complete your continuing education hours by a certain deadline. And also, if your license lapses, you have to pay a reinstatement fee to come back and practice again. So one thing I talked about as a creative idea would be looking at potentially if the board could consider something where we could reduce that reinstatement fee for a temporary time and have sort of a little window of time to invite people to come back to the profession. Might that be a good way that we could also grow our base in terms of the number of licensees who have already met the requirements for licensure once? And is there a way that we can increase the number of practitioners without considering things that might go against the public protection mission of the board? So some of these ideas were interesting to explore. There were a lot of good discussions at the conference, but I wanted to share a little bit about some of those items that we have been discussing here at the board office and that I'll be taking to the board at the next board meeting for their consideration as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and I can stand for any questions.
Thank you, David. Any questions?
Has it been considered to have an inactive status for licensure that people could elect if they are stepping out for whatever reason, but want to preserve that option to come back without having to jump through as many hoops?
I don't think there's been any recent discussions by the board about that. I think over the years there have been discussions about it. It's not currently in statute, so it would need to be something that could be changed. I've also heard from some of the other states that basically say you might have a little bit of a window right after your license lapses where you would have to pay a small penalty to reactivate your license, but it wouldn't be the same amount as a full license cost. So there are some other ways to look at that. But the inactive license, that's not something that's currently been proposed, but that is something from other states, and they did mention it there at the conference as well.
I know Oklahoma has that.
All right, good question for us to keep in mind. There's no further questions for David. We'll move on our agenda item to old business. The first item is continued consideration of regulatory language for implementation of SB 453 standards for LSCSW applicants with no clinical practicum. So David, I will turn that over to you.
Okay, great. So this is, I'm going to try to clarify this because it could be a little confusing when we talk about this topic. So I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen here. And I'll show you some previous language here. In your packet of material, you should see a handout that says summary of recent changes to KSA 65-6306 D1C. And these are some changes in the last couple of years that are relevant to individuals applying for a clinical level of social work license, specifically those that did not have a clinical practicum when they applied for consideration. So back in 2021, the BSRB had a bill that we requested for the legislature, and it had a number of different changes in the bill. One of the items was looking at the number of direct client contact hours for different professions to receive a clinical level license. And at the time, we had, the board had submitted a proposed change to lower the number of direct client contact hours from 350 hours of direct client contact down to 200 hours. And when that bill was heard in committee, there was an amendment that was put on the bill that instead of lowering it to 200 hours, it would strike that language requiring 350 hours of direct client contact. The issue with that amendment when it was put on the bill is that after the session had ended and the bill did pass and was enacted, our legal counsel said that that amendment that was put on the bill went further than just striking 350 hours of direct client contact. It struck this highlighted language here that says, or additional postgraduate supervised experience as determined by the board. And the effect of striking that highlighted language was that previously there were some requirements for individuals seeking a clinical level license. And so the board was able to evaluate candidates who had a clinical level practicum, but it could also evaluate individuals who did not have a clinical level practicum by looking at other additional postgraduate supervised experience as determined by the board. And there is some regulatory language that was used by the board to evaluate those candidates. Well, with this highlighted language struck, it meant that the board no longer had that flexibility to evaluate individuals unless they had a clinical practicum. So it limited the number of individuals that we could consider if they applied for licensure. So when the 2022 legislative session was coming up, one of the items the BSRB asked for and requested in bill form was this language that was ultimately enacted in Senate Bill 453. So we did not try to add back the 350 hours of direct client contact or the 200 hours previously proposed, but we did ask for the flexible language to be able to evaluate those candidates who did not have a clinical practicum by adding back the language or additional postgraduate supervised experience as determined by the board. And so this essentially says you would have needed to receive a supervised clinical practicum meeting certain standards or have received other additional postgraduate experience as determined by the board. So the legislature did go ahead and add back this flexible language for the BSRB to consider those candidates. However, the way that this works is that the statutes provide the broad overall framework in law, and then the regulations really flush out how that should be interpreted. And so when the legislature added this back, it was the first step, but now the next step will be for the board to add back language and regulation to clarify how this should be done and how the BSRB can evaluate these candidates who didn't have a clinical practicum. So going back to the first, when this language was struck, this highlighted language was struck, it meant that the regulation language that gave us the flexibility to evaluate those candidates needed to go away too. So we went through the process of submitting the regulations to be repealed as well, to be struck. And then when the bill was passed this past year, 453, and language was added back, now we have to go through the process of determining what language should essentially either come back or what new language needs to be reintroduced in regulation to give us the guidelines to evaluate those individuals with a non-clinical practicum. So that is the first step here. Now, the second thing that I will direct your attention to is that in your packet, you also have another document that says, I'll go ahead and share my screen here again. So this second document says select text from KAR 102-2-12 licensed specialist clinical social worker license requirements. And so this was language that was previously in regulation. And if you actually go to the Secretary of State's website and look at the regulation, you will see this current language. It's in the process of being changed. And so I will clarify for you. You see some multicolored text here, and I'll explain why that's multicolored. So first things first, in this section, previously, what this section did is it specified how to evaluate the individuals who had a clinical level practicum in A, and then for those that did not, it added clarifying language in B. So with the new change, we submitted for language in B to be struck. And what needs to really be considered now is how much of this language from B should be brought back to provide a framework to the BSRB to evaluate these candidates, or should this language be replaced with new language? Now, the old language that's in the process of being struck, we'll go with the green. The green talked about a previous requirement of 4,000 hours of postgraduate supervised experience. That had been changed in bill form and statute, and so that has been lowered down to 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised experience. So that is the new standard, is the 3,000 hours of postgraduate experience. This language in blue that talks about the experience should consist of not less than 700 hours of supervised experience, including not less than 350 hours of direct client contact. So the 350 hours of direct client contact existed prior to that bill being changed that removed that as a requirement for the individuals with a clinical level practicum. Now, as a thing to consider in this, the board had previously looked and had submitted to the legislature a change to make this about 200 hours instead of 350 hours of direct client contact. And then the rest of the language there in yellow, that language is currently in the process of being eliminated because that whole section would be eliminated if we didn't have the flexible language. So that is something to consider if you want this language to come back to evaluate those individuals with a non-clinical practicum. But in essence, with that flexible language added back to statute, the BSRB needs some sort of way to measure the individuals that had a different type of practicum, such as an administrative practicum. As it currently reads, the individuals who had a clinical level practicum, we have a way to verify that they had direct client contact because it was part of their clinical practicum experience. But for the individuals who had a non-clinical practicum, we need to have a way to measure that they received training and that they have some experience, direct client contact with certain individuals. And so we are bringing this to you, and hopefully I framed this appropriately. Leslie Allen, the Assistant Director and Licensing Manager, she's familiar with this language too. And Leslie, if there was something that I didn't address or speak about or something needs to be clarified, feel free to jump in. But hopefully this frames sort of the time frame of how this language was in place. It's currently in the process of being eliminated. And now that the bill passed this year, we need something to come back to replace the previous standard. And I realize it's complicated, so if you do have questions, feel free to jump in and let me know.
I have a question. So you're talking about somebody who did not have a clinical practicum in their master's program, who is applying for an LSCSW?
That's correct.
So there's some other way for them to have gotten their clinical experience that we have to figure out what standard to set for that? Or are we saying someone who has only administrative experience, this opens a path for them to get an LSCSW, even if they haven't had any clinical practicum or postgraduate clinical experience?
This would be added to their postgraduate clinical experience because they didn't have a clinical practicum
during their master's program. Okay.
Right.
All right, I understand now. So they could have gotten hours after postgraduate. They would have done their supervised hours. They just didn't have a clinical practice in their education. Okay.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
And this will be a small group of individuals that this would apply to. But it is still a group that we do see apply for licensure, sometimes from other states. And so it would be helpful for us to have a way to do this sort of analysis if those individuals do apply for a license.
It is a lot to digest. Are there any other questions or discussion? David, are we looking for recommendations at this time?
If you had recommendations, we could definitely take them now. This is something that would be essentially going into a new regulation. So it's not something that has a hard time frame. With the statutes, those are things that need to be submitted in time for us to get them before the legislature next year. But now that we have that statute in place, the regulatory language, we can submit at any time. So if you do need more time as an advisory committee to consider different options, that's okay too. We want to make sure that whatever we put in, you've had a chance to think about, and it is kind of confusing, but we wanted to make sure that you understood the time frame and understood what we're seeking here. So if you have recommendations, we could definitely take them today. If you have them perhaps at the next meeting, we could also take them at that time too.
Anybody have any thoughts right now? We have seen this before, so just curious if anybody has any thoughts.
So what was the blue highlight? You're saying that was going to be removed?
So the green highlighted was changed when a bill passed a couple of years ago that lowered the number of 4,000 hours down to 3,000 hours. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. That's currently in statute, so that would need to be changed down to at least 3,000 hours if that was going to be a component. The blue, the number 350 hours was eliminated for the individuals who had a clinical practicum in statute last year. The BSRB at the time had proposed that be reduced from 350 down to 200 hours. So that is something to consider, but the green was modified a couple of years ago, and then the blue was modified last year. So I just wanted you to know sort of the history. This is the current language in the process of being repealed completely, but if you were looking to replace it, I probably wouldn't recommend you going back to exactly how this language looks. I just wanted you to know some of the history because some of this language was in statute and regulation, whereas some of it is just in regulation.
Is there the regulations that were in place before that you said got struck? Do we have a copy of those, or do we know what those were to consider since we're coming back around to reinstate it?
That's what you have in front of you right now.
So that's the totality of it?
Correct. In A, the only additional thing that is currently in the process of being struck under A, it has to do with that first line that says completion of one of the following experience requirements. So this section here on 2, because 2 would have allowed either A or B. So with B going away, you don't need this line here. And then the only other part of A that's going away has to do with that line that says, and shall include not less than 350 hours of direct client contact. Because with that part being struck out of the statute, it would no longer apply to individuals in section A. So that part would be struck out of A, and then all of section B is going away under the current regulation change that we have already submitted. So A really wouldn't need any changes. It would just be, what do you want to replace B with now that we can continue to evaluate those applicants?
You're saying they aren't going to put shall include not less than 200 hours direct client contact in that first A.
Correct. So that would be going away from part A, the reference to the 350 hours of direct client contact. because previously that was included in the statute, and then it was included here in the regulation under A. So with it being removed from the statute, it is being removed from the regulation as well. So part A is when you're talking about individuals with the clinical practicum, and then B would be the other individuals who had a non-clinical practicum.
It's kind of nice to use that track changes on these kinds of forms. So then that way you can put in what, like the 3,000 for the 4,000, the 200 for the 350. And anyways, it's just a lot easier to read that way and to remember what you had stated when we come back to look at this after we've slept. So anyways, I don't know.
Sure. Well, and officially, this is all still in the regulations. So in terms of, if there's a direct conflict between the statute and the regulations, we have to follow the statute. So with there being a conflict here with the 350 hours already being eliminated for the individuals with the clinical practicum, even though this is still officially in the regulation, we follow the statute first. And then in section B with the 4,000 hours, this is still in the regulation currently, even though it's in the process of being struck. So wanted to make you aware in case you went ahead and looked up the regulation, this is currently still on the books, though it is in the process of being changed.
So I just so I understand, the blue part is going away, and there's no longer going to be any specified number of hours of direct client contact required for either the practicum during your master's program or when you're going to get as part of your postgraduate supervised experience. There isn't going to be any requirement of a certain number of hours of direct contact.
There will be
in either case.
I'm sorry. There is a need to have a number of direct client contact hours for those who did not have a clinical practicum. So even though we are removing B in our current regulations that we're trying to move through, we're going to have to put it back in the regulation for those with an administrative track practicum.
But it will be that 350 hours?
No, that's what the committee needs to decide is the number of hours. Mm-hmm.
But it's definite that we have to specify a certain number of hours.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, any other thoughts? How do we think it's best to come up with the recommendation from our committee? And that's a question for everyone.
I don't know what process has been used before on something like this, but could it be handled like the comment period on the compact? Could we have an opportunity to submit ideas about it and then discuss that at our next meeting to decide which ones to recommend?
So I don't know that there's an official way for us to do that. But if individuals wanted to send me comments, they definitely could send me and I could collect those if that would be the preference of the advisory committee. As just a starting position, one thing that you could consider is for those individuals with a non-clinical practicum to have a way to verify that they did complete some direct client contact. You could have the 200 number. That was what the board had forwarded. It would only involve that small group that did not have a clinical practicum. but that could be a starting point for you to start with. And then if you wanted to do a different number, you could, but as a placeholder of somewhere to start to do the evaluation here, you could start from that number if you wanted to do so.
Well, for some like that has their bachelor's, I'm the BSW, LBSW person on the crew here. I'm not really for sure the 200 hours, what would that be outlined specifically that would need to be covered? Like
Currently, how it's always been. So this might be a good place to say that it is the hours are obtained in the same manner that the postgraduate supervised work experience is completed. So it would actually be added to that. So if, for example, if someone has to do 1,500 hours of direct client contact and you did 200, they would have to do 1,700 hours of direct client contact. So it would be included in their post-grad experience. When they do their training plan, they would be told that they had to do that. So it is kind of laid out the way it has to be done and what the hours have to be.
And Leslie, where is that laid out? I'm sorry.
yeah.
And it's later in the regulation, it talks about you have to have so many hours of direct client contact providing psychotherapy and assessment. So that would be where the 200 additional hours would be. Last time they added additional to the total number of hours, which seemed a little excessive in the number of hours that there were. But so you can do that or not, that's up to you. But it is in 102-1-12. And then the supervision requirements are in 102-2-8.
And I want to make it very clear too, that the group that we're talking about in terms of applicants that these would apply to, it's a pretty small group. We're talking about maybe 5 to 10 applicants per year that would be applying for a clinical level license without a clinical practicum. So for the vast majority of individuals applying for a clinical level license, it would not affect them at all. This is really just talking about those few applicants that apply that do not have a clinical practicum when they apply for licensure.
And David and Leslie, I just want to clarify, because I know that there has been concern expressed in the past around that CSWE, for example, does not or did not require the 350 hours. And so I think looking at the 200, I would love to have that be based off of something. And if you're saying that that's further down in the regulations, then maybe I need to relook at that, because I don't want to pick just an arbitrary number.
Oh, no, I would. That's not further in the regulation. I meant how you have to obtain the hours. The standards for the clinical license are further down in the regulation, the number of hours. The however many hours you choose will not be, we will not ask if that was part of their administrative practicum. If they didn't have a clinical practicum, they have to do additional postgraduate supervised hours. So CSWE wouldn't come into play. So then how you come to your number is obviously up to you.
So I have a question. Would these additional
The
hours
rationale,
be
people who,
Sorry, Eric, I think we have a little delay with Cynthia, a lag time. Do you want to go ahead, Eric? And then when Cynthia comes back online, but it may interrupt just a moment.
Okay. My question was, is these additional hours, are they going to be incorporated into the training plan for the LSCSW? Like they'll know those when they submit that plan? Or will this be something that has to be done before the plan can be considered by the BSRB, or something that will be considered after the plan is completed?
For Kansas residents, for Kansas LMSWs, they will do it as part of their training plan. So when they submit their training plan, if they don't already know they'd have to do the hours, we would tell them. So they would be aware going in that they'd have to do the additional hours.
So it's just adding a few hours to their training plan.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
I was going to say that the rationale for requiring those extra hours is that those that did have a clinical practicum at the end of their postgraduate supervised experience would have a total of more face-to-face direct contact hours than someone who didn't have a clinical practicum. So you're trying to create an equivalent.
Mhm.
And I don't know if we have data, since CSWE did not require 350 hours specifically. Do we have any data on average number of face-to-face direct client contact those that have done a clinical practicum have actually had? If we have some kind of a round number, that might be a jumping off point if we're trying to create apples to apples by adding some hours for those that didn't have it in their graduate education. Do we know, David? Do we have any of that? Do we have any such data?
I'm not familiar with that. Leslie, are you familiar with any data like that?
No, I'm not, because CSWE said that they do their outcomes and they don't really have, they have to cover specific things, but they don't really have, they don't count the hours that they have in direct client contact. So we don't really have that.
We'd have to get that directly from the programs.
Right.
Is what
So,
they're.
I graduated from the University of Kansas program, and I want to, it's been a little bit, but I want to say that theirs was 300 hours of contact for clinical contact. And they said that that was the recommended amount, because there's no way to require a face-to-face contact piece, especially when you're talking about people that are just receiving training and it's done through 2 semesters. So, I mean, the 200, 300, I mean, those are pretty close within line of each other from what David kind of threw out there and recommended versus what was in the University of Kansas program.
So if I'm understanding correctly, Eric, since we're talking about that particular university, I believe that they required, or that recommended 350 is because the BSRB required that, not CSWE. And so they wanted to prepare students to meet the requirements of BSRB with that 350. But I haven't been able to find any information about where that 350 hours came from the BSRB side. And so I think that's what led into some advocacy of taking that 350 out, because it's not required in a lot of different states, is my understanding. But David and Leslie, if I'm misspeaking.
You were right. Yeah. That's true.
So if we were to pick 200, we're still basing it off of a very arbitrary number to begin with.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties is that if we don't have a number, it kind of limits our ability to establish sort of an equivalence to measure whether these individuals can meet a certain standard to be licensed. And so that's kind of the difficult part of this equation right now, I think.
Well, maybe we go at it from the standpoint of what would be a minimum number of face-to-face contact hours that one might expect to have in a clinical practicum for an MSW program. And again, if we don't have any central database that tells us the actual real life hours that students have, we'd have to get that information from the programs themselves, if they even gather it themselves. But any of us that have done an MSW, we can probably give a ballpark figure of how many face-to-face hours you had over 2 years of practicum, right?
Well, and what I'll tell you is that the quality of those face-to-face hours are incredibly variable depending on the site they went to. So I can tell you my experience, because I had quite a bit of experience prior to my LMSW. I was doing therapy for almost the entirety of the 600 or 700 total hours. So I had tons of face-to-face. I was in classes with people that up until they're midway through the second semester of their practicum, they weren't actually allowed to speak in their sessions. They were sitting in the session with another therapist and essentially observing. So the variability and the amount of quality of those contact hours would be pretty massive, even if you did come up with a number. Because I know University of Kansas used a Sonia system, which was an electronic hours tracking system, so they could probably come up with a number, but I can tell you that the variability is going to be a lot.
Yeah, and I would echo that from many years ago at KU as well, the quite variable experience, which sort of begs the question is, how fair is it to hold people that didn't have one of those clinical practicums to, a certain standard if we can't really say that everybody who did a clinical practicum met that standard themselves because of the variability, even within one program we're talking about, much less across all of the programs that people come from. So from that standpoint, I'm inclined to go with the lower number. I think 200 is a reasonable number, but being as those that did get a clinical practicum may or may not have had 200 hours of face-to-face direct contact with clients, then, we have to set the bar somewhere that seems fair if we're going to say that we have to create some equivalency for those that didn't do the clinical.
Well, I thought the 200 seemed pretty fair as well. And I don't see any problem with requiring more hours of clinical experience, whether they're poor or great. You can pick stuff up through social learning, as we all know. So even if they were just sitting in the room, that's better than nothing. And I think requiring some measure of hours has to be an important piece, just from the stance of somebody who supervises practicum students. People who have more experience are just better therapists. So requiring that experience seems like a good way to create better clinical level clinicians out there, because we're talking about people who are going to be practicing independently.
So right now, the required number of hours for postgraduate to be considered for licensure is 3,000. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So then one option that we're discussing is this particular individual that would fall in this category would be looking at the 3,000 plus an additional 200.
It depends. If you want it to be direct client contact, then it would be 1,700 direct client contact, and you could actually leave it at 3,000 or raise it to 3,200. It would be up to you. Or it will work itself out in the wash while they're doing their direct client contact.
So I guess part of it, and I understand for people that have graduated years past like myself, but for the new students that are going to a university, there wouldn't be that requirement of the 350 hours. And so really, we don't even have any idea of how much direct client contact hours they would have had in their practicum experience.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that for me, the 200 hours is going to be a marker of, because just as you said, Eric, I mean, I could have done my practicum and done those 350 hours, and most of those could have been me saying nothing. And we have practicums now that, I mean, people are, some aren't necessarily considering it a clinical experience, but like answering crisis phone calls to me is borders on clinical, but that practicum may not necessarily count it as that. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, I don't think we, for all those reasons, I don't think we're really going to be able to create a true equivalency. So we have to approximate. If we have to pick a number and we have to specify some way to evaluate those that for licensure that didn't have a clinical practicum, you know, we have to make an educated guess is the best we can do, even though, yeah, that may inherently be unfair to some people who did have a clinical practicum that was of poor quality, but, and then the person that didn't have a clinical practicum still has to do 200 hours. But I guess that's what the statute that was passed is requiring us to do, right, David? We have to set a number.
So the statute gives us the ability to evaluate those applicants by looking at other postgraduate experience, and then determining what that would be is what we have to put into the regulation. And so that's kind of the big framework of it.
I don't know that we have to pick a number. Do we?
I mean, I think we need to have some sort of a way to standardize the process so that it's not subjective, and we have something that we can clearly show, you know, as a way for our staff to measure that. If it's not a number, we need something that is very identifiable and something that's objective and we can standardize with it. And so I'm not sure what that would be if it's not a number.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I know it's 2:45 and we have technically 15 minutes left in our scheduled meeting. I guess one thing I would just throw out there is that if the person who was postgraduate completed their clinical supervision hours and completed their supervisor gave them a positive review and was recommending them, I just don't know that the 200 additional hours is going to make them any better of a supervisor when they get done with those 3,000 hours. Or I'm sorry, any better of a clinician.
Well, my stance of it, which I think is exactly on the opposite, is, I mean, if you talk about a 20-hour contact week as your average, you know, therapist out there working, we're only really talking about an extra 2-3 months here that they're collecting hours. And if there's somebody who's really pushing, it could get down as much as an extra 30 days that we're talking about here with 200 hours. I don't know if that's going to be a huge something that really deters people from going to that next level. Licensure is, hey, you got to give us an extra 200 hours.
Actually, the alternative is to go back to school and do a clinical practicum. And I've been told that's thousands of dollars because one person did it. And because we don't have any authority to approve someone with a non-clinical practicum right now. And so she went ahead and went back and did it. And she wasn't happy when she found out the law changed.
I bet.
I wouldn't be happy either.
Well, I mean, I guess the bottom line question is, if we don't have some standard, then we're essentially saying that if you know that you want to be a clinical social worker, so you practicum as part of your MSW, that essentially has no value against as compared to if you figure out that you want to be a clinical social worker after you get your MSW, having had a non-clinical practicum. You know, if there's no difference in the licensure process, then we're kind of really devaluing the practicum, clinical practicum during your graduate education.
And I would agree with that. I think it would tend to have a person take the easier route. And if it's easier to not do the practicum and all the stuff that goes with it, I can see that happening.
I mean, in my experience with social workers that I've known through the years, it's more that someone didn't necessarily clearly see that that was the path that they wanted to take with social work. They may have had another idea and worked in some other type of social work before they decided to become a clinician. And so then they have to, get in line and do all of the same things that those that did know all along that that's what they wanted.
And so by having the 200 or 300 hours, it allows them to do that. So I think it's a good option.
Andrea, would you feel more comfortable with a lower number, or are you just uncomfortable with a number at all?
I just wish we had some information to back that number up instead of just picking a number. But if the committee is ready to move forward a recommendation, and if we want to, if people are ready, we can do that. Or the other suggestion was that we could send our suggestions to David via email. So what do people feel more comfortable with?
I personally feel pretty comfortable with the 200-hour recommendation. I think that's an incredibly small price to pay when you figure it would be $10,000 a semester or more to go back and repeat the coursework.
Okay.
Yeah, you're essentially going to pay for 5 more hours. It's about, 5 more hours of supervision because it's 40 hours, or you have to have 1 hour of supervision for every 40, right? Isn't that the number?
20 hours for direct contact. It's 20 hours, and you'd pay 10 more supervision sessions.
Right, which if you're purchasing your supervision outside your agency, that's going to cost you that much, which will be a lot less than 10,000.
Even the most, I was gonna say, even the most ridiculous amounts I've heard charged, it wouldn't break 1,500 to 2,000.
Mike,
I would be curious what some of the other, like the professional counselors do. How many hours were the marriage and family therapist? The reason I say that is I know I have a friend that's a marriage family therapist who is leaving the state because they can't meet this requirement. They're going to go back to the state they were in before.
The state, so it depends if it's like CSWE accredited. So if it's accredited by KCREP for the counselors, the total is 280 hours of direct client contact. For MFT and COMFT, their accreditation, it's 500 hours of direct client contact. If their program is not accredited by the professional organization, then in the regulations for MFT, it's only 300.
And 50, right, Leslie?
No, just for the LMFT, it's 300.
Okay.
The 350, yes, for the clinical.
Okay. And professional counseling was recently lowered, I think, from 350 to 280, I believe, in the bill last year. So.
Yeah.
I think in those professions, they don't, their practicum is always going to be clinical because that they don't have all the different tracks that we have in social work.
Right.
So they're never going to be in that equivalent situation exactly. But those numbers are certain that you just said were certainly in the ballpark that we're talking about.
Kristen?
Yeah. I was going to say that helps me to know that information. So 200 would be a very minimal kind of expectation, I would think.
Kristen, Kristen, were you going to say something?
I was, but I can't remember what I was gonna say, so I put myself back on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
All right. What would we like to do? Would we like to go ahead and make the recommendation or submit suggestions to David? I know we had Eric say that he's ready to make his recommendation. Everybody raise your hand if you're ready.
I'll just say aye.
Okay, so looks like we have, okay, we'll just go ahead and say who would like to recommend making the 200 hours the amount that we're going to add in this particular scenario. And raise your hand one more time.
This is Lee. I raised my hand.
Lee, good, thank you. So we have Mary, Kristen, Cynthia, Eric, Donna, Sarah, Katie, Angie, and Lee.
I'm raising my hand as well. This is
And
Robin.
Robin. Okay, so the majority is ready to make that recommendation, David.
Okay.
All right, so David, can you help me out here? We have 10 minutes and we have quite a bit left on the agenda.
Yeah, so I think I can help out. Okay, so the next item has to do with consideration of changes to in residence language. And this has to do with the requirements of educational programs. So I'll frame this and see if perhaps maybe you can take a consideration of this at the next meeting. So essentially, we've talked about this a little bit before. For individuals who did not attend a program for their education that was accredited by the national accrediting body, there's some standards that have to be met in regulation. And one of them talks about your education had to be received in residence, at least no less than 50% of the coursework had to be received in residence. For reference, this is KAR 102-2-6. And so the in residence is defined as a student is present at the physical location of the institution for the purpose of completing coursework during which the student and one or more core faculty members are in face-to-face contact. So we've discussed this before. Our current requirement in regulation for those individuals who did not attend an accredited or a nationally accredited program, our requirement that they be at the physical location of the institution is rare. I have not heard of another one for the social work profession, a state that has that requirement. And so what I am bringing forward to the advisory committees to discuss and consider is, do you feel like it's appropriate to remove the requirement of being in the same physical location when you're doing the in residence? So that in residence definition talks about being in face-to-face contact. It talks about being in front of one or more core faculty members. There is still a way to keep that part of the definition, but remove the part that just talks about being in the same physical location. And so what face-to-face would then be interpreted as was it could be either over a screen or it could be in the same physical place, but it wouldn't require someone to be at the same physical place. So the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee recently recommended removing that requirement to be in the same physical presence. I'm encouraging other advisory committees to consider removing that too from their regulations if they feel like it's not going to endanger the public protection mission of the board. So we talked about this briefly in the last meeting. I want to bring it to you again to see if you wanted to make a recommendation to remove that requirement that the student would have to be at the same physical location of the institution.
And David, would you like us to make a recommendation?
If you are in support of that, a motion could be made. And one way that you could change the definition would be just to strike certain language from that in residence definition, so that with that struck, it would say in residence when used to describe a student means that the student is completing coursework during which the student and one or more core faculty members are in face-to-face contact. So you only remove the part that requires the physical presence or being the physical location. So
would we have to add a language defining face-to-face contact as including screens?
And Leslie Allen, you might have to clarify this a little bit for me. I know we've discussed that face-to-face is meant to mean that, but we could definitely add some clarifying language if it's not included in the first regulation, that's what it would mean, either in face-to-face by being there together or over a screen.
I don't know if it would need to be defined, but if so, we could put it in the definition regulation. It's currently defined in the in face-to-face contact with clients. So it is referenced that face-to-face means that you can see each other and hear each other, but you don't have to be in the same space.
After our discussion the other day in our planning meeting, I would be comfortable to make a motion that we make that modification that you just described, David, to strike the in-residence requirement.
No, and just to clarify, is your motion to strike the part that requires you to be in the same physical presence? So the in-residence would still stay in place, just that part of the definition of in-residence would go away.
Yes, that's my motion.
This is Lee. I second the motion.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Any opposed? All right, hearing none, that motion has carried. Thank you so much. The next items on the agenda are pretty quick, just an update that we will be and have brought some of the information to the board, to the larger board, and I think we'll look forward to more discussion on that in regards to clinical supervision and also the continuing education on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So with that, I will move over to new business, and we talked about the draft language for social work compact. David will be sending out those links in order for you all and your colleagues to provide feedback on that. Any other discussion on that item? Mike?
Yeah, I had a question. The items we talked about and received from the advisors today from NASW and from the other organization, is that information we can share and talk about with other colleagues, or is that a part of the closed meeting?
Nope, that part is definitely open. This meeting is being broadcast, and so it's available. So anything that happened in this meeting, feel free to share with anyone else and get that feedback from anyone too. That's perfectly fine. And if you think someone might be interested in seeing that information, just let them know about the BSRB YouTube channel, and they can go back and actually watch the meeting because it'll be available after we get done too.
Great question, Mike. All right, and then the next item under new business is the licensed psychology regulation on continuing education. Is that something that you can speak briefly about, David?
Yes, I think I should get this done under a minute. This is something I shared with the board at the last board meeting. Licensed psychologists have a unique regulation. It's 102-1-15G, and it basically provides a method to have additional time to complete continuing education hours if you come up upon renewal and you still need additional time to complete them. There's a process you have to follow. You have to qualify for this, but it is unique to the licensed psychology profession. So go ahead and take a look. There's a copy in your packet, but it's KAR 102-1-15G. And maybe at the next meeting, if you can come in ready to discuss, if you think this would be helpful to add for the social work profession with some modifications or as it is, and then we could talk about it next time.
Okay, does that sound okay with everyone? We will move that forward. So the other item, and you all received this attachment as well in your documents, was the Association of Social Work Boards exam pass rate analysis. And wanted to see, this is something that I think is going to be talked about a lot. What are people's initial thoughts and how we can be supporting?
And Andrea, I will just mention before we get too deep into this topic, there is some additional information that individuals can find on the ASWB website. It's at www.aswb.org/exam/contributing-to the conversation, essentially. So it's aswb.org/exam/contributing to the conversation. And there's some information in there with some links to the full report. It's also going to be posted on our website in the materials from the meeting. There's some information as far as exam performance by states, exam performance by social work programs and schools. And so feel free to take a look at that information on the ASWB's website too.
I do have a question about materials. I don't know if this is the right time to ask it or not, but would it be possible to get them any earlier than the day before these meetings, or is that something that can only happen within a certain amount of time? Like the packet, I didn't have time to read all of it as well as I want to be able to be familiar with the material for these discussions. So that's my question is, can they come out any earlier?
Yeah, and we usually send it out a little bit earlier. This time we had to send it out the day before, but we will try to give you a little bit more opportunity to read some of those documents.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, which is fair if not everyone has had a chance to read. It's a pretty lengthy document, but does have some information in there that I think as a committee would be worth our while to discuss. And just it sounds like there's people making some pretty quick decisions in other states on the information that has been based on the information that's been released. So Cynthia, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I haven't had a chance to read all of those materials, but I read through the summary and I was really shocked at the discrepancy based on race and ethnicity. It was almost 50% difference at the various levels. So, you know, that's an unacceptable variation that I don't know what the solution is at this point, but I think we definitely need to discuss whether or not we think that the use of that exam should be our standard when there's that level of clear bias. And just what Becky reported about the tripling of their clinicians after they removed the necessity of that exam, that of clinicians from diverse ethnicities. That's very telling as well, that it has apparently been a barrier. So I think it definitely bears further discussion.
And what I'm not sure about is the time frame that we have in order to make any suggestions or recommendations. So, and I don't know, David, if that's further explained in the website that you just gave us.
Yeah, so on the website for ASWB, under the examination section, there's some information about a social work workforce coalition that was formed. There's also information about a social work census, and there's a link here. It's called Contributing to the Conversation. And so I think there are ways to contact ASWB and offer some comments or be a part of some of their meetings that they're planning to talk about a little bit more about the exam data too. So I would encourage everyone to go ahead and take a look at that website, and you're welcome to contact me too if you have difficulty getting to it, and I can connect you to those resources too.
So just to give people a little bit more information on what Cynthia is talking about, if you haven't had a chance to look too deeply into the report, just a little synopsis of first-time pass rates for bachelor's exam when they were comparing race and ethnicities. For white test takers, it was 76.5% versus Black test takers, it was 34.6%. And then when you look at just a snapshot of the clinical exam, the percentage of passing for white individuals is 83.8% versus Black test takers at 44.7%. So it's a pretty wide discrepancy there.
And I think this is something that's been known for a while. Becky indicated that NASW has been talking with them for years about this bias and trying to correct it. And yet this is this report is showing that it's still very much present and robustly present. So, we can certainly provide whatever feedback we want to ASWB, but we don't, as far as I understand, they don't have a process in place for trying to actually change it. What this was just studying the results and putting the information out there. Right, David, that task force, are they actually looking to try to change anything about it?
Well, it sounds like some states are making some changes. And as I understood from our public comment, it seemed like not the clinical exam, it's more of the other exams that were being removed as a requirement.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, and I know that ASWB, since they released this report recently, they have started to have meetings to talk about the information in the report that was released. And so in terms of things going forward, this is definitely something that I'm going to be keeping an eye on, and I will try to be, sit in on those meetings and bring back information to you about the future of the exam and possible changes that they would be looking at. So I'll just give you an update at the next advisory committee meeting, if that would be helpful, and just let you know what I've collected and bring it back to your, so you can all take a look at it too.
I'm going to have to go. I have a patient.
Yes, thank you, Robin. I know we're running over. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. So if we can just make sure to read those materials so that we can be prepared to have a conversation next time, that would be great. And then David, do you mind sending that email that website that you just referenced as well?
Sure.
Along with the additional.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and send a follow-up email with the compact information, those links, and then I'll also send a direct link to this information from ASWB as well.
Okay, thank you. So with that, our next meeting is scheduled for October 18th at 1 p.m. virtually. Are there any committee discussion items that we'd like to have on the agenda from this group?
Well, a continuation of this about the ASWB.
Yes, for sure. Okay, and next time Cynthia will be guiding the agenda. So we'll look forward to that. And then it looks like we are at the end of our agenda. So I will take a motion to adjourn.
This is Lee. I may put a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. A motion to adjourn, a second.
Support.
Thank you, Mike. All right. I don't know if I have to say this, but all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, motion carries. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for going over the 3 o'clock hour. I appreciate your time and your patience, and we will see you in October. Have an excellent rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.